The desert was silent, the kind of silence that makes your chest feel heavy, as if the world itself had stopped breathing. The moon hung low, pale and watchful, spilling its glow over endless stretches of dust and shadow. The air was dry, carrying only the faint rustle of wind through brittle grass. Out there, nothing stirred. Not a horse, not a man, not a whisper. It was the kind of night when you could travel for miles and feel like the last soul alive. But then something broke through, soft, fragile, barely a sound at all, a voice so faint it seemed impossible it had come from the emptiness. The cowboy stopped. He wasn't the sort of man who spooked easy, but this sound made his skin prickle. He pulled on the reins of his horse, listening. For a moment there was nothing but silence again, just the wind sighing. Then it came once more. A tiny cry, not the cry of an animal, not the call of a bird, something else. It was thin and trembling like a thread of sound tugged through the darkness. He held his breath. "Mama!" The word was weak, almost swallowed by the night, but he heard it, clear as if it had been whispered right beside him. His heart gave a sharp kick in his chest. He thought he must have imagined it, a trick of the desert maybe. But then it came again, softer this time, like a fading echo. "Mama!" The cowboy shifted in his saddle, scanning the shadows. His horse stamped the ground uneasily, ears twitching at the sound. He slid one hand to the holster on his hip, not sure if he was walking into danger or into madness. But he couldn't ride on, not after hearing that. No man with blood in his veins could. Slowly he swung down from his horse, boots crunching in the dust. The silence pressed close again, thick and heavy, as if daring him to move forward. He took a step, then another. The sound came once more, so faint now he could barely trust it, yet it pulled him, tugging at something deep in his chest. His eyes searched the ground, the brush, the rocks scattered pale under the moonlight. That's when he saw it. A small shape. A bundle tossed carelessly near the edge of a gully. A sack. And from inside that sack, the sound that shouldn't have been possible. He froze where he stood, staring at the bundle as the wind curled around his hat brim and tugged at his coat. A sack, tied rough at the top, sagged against the earth as though it held nothing worth keeping. Yet from inside that thin fabric had come a sound that did not belong to the desert at all. The cowboy swallowed hard, throat dry, and for a heartbeat he wondered if his mind was playing tricks on him. Long nights alone on the trail had a way of twisting silence into voices. But then the sack shifted. Just the smallest tremor, like something stirring within, weak but alive. He moved closer, slow, careful, each step crunching against gravel. His hand brushed the rope at his side, steadying himself as if he needed proof he was still standing in the real world. The smell of dust hung heavy, mixed now with something faint and sour. Milk turned old, damp cloth. He stopped only a few feet away. The sack quivered once more, and a muffled cry leaked out, thin and sharp, so small it could snap in half against the night air. He crouched down, his knees creaking, and reached out a rough, calloused hand. The fabric was coarse beneath his fingers. He hesitated. Men like him weren't often stopped in their tracks. He'd faced storms, coyotes, even men who meant him harm. But nothing had ever made his pulse hammer quite like this. Slowly he tugged at the knot. The rope was tight, tied by someone who had meant for it never to come undone. His fingers worked at it, fumbling, urgency pressing on him with every second that passed. Finally the knot gave way, the sack loosening in his hands. He peeled back the edge of the cloth. Inside, pale against the darkness, was a face, tiny, fragile. The skin was flushed red, lips trembling with the effort of the smallest breath. Eyes barely open, glossy in the moonlight, searching for something that wasn't there. And then that faint word again, broken and weak, falling from the baby's mouth as though it had been carried all this way by sheer will. "Mama!" The cowboy felt his chest tighten. His hands trembled, though they were hands used to gripping reins, swinging ropes, steadying pistols without a shake. But now they hovered uncertain, afraid to touch something so delicate. He slid his arms beneath the child, lifting carefully, as if the baby might break at the weight of his own hold. The bundle was lighter than a sack of flour, lighter than a rabbit snared at dusk, yet heavy in a way no man could put into words. The baby let out a weak cry, not strong enough to echo, only enough to press against the cowboy's ear as he held the small body against his chest. He glanced around, his eyes sweeping the horizon. Empty. No campfires flickering. No shadows moving. Whoever had left this child here was gone, gone without looking back. His jaw tightened, the brim of his hat dipping low as he pulled the baby closer. What kind of heart could do this? To tie up a life so small, so helpless, and leave it to the mercy of coyotes or cold or silence. His mind tried to make sense of it, but sense would not come. All he could feel was the faint flutter of the child's breath against his shirt, and the weight of responsibility sliding onto his shoulders. He glanced at the sack again, its opening wide now, the inside still damp from where the child had sweated and cried. Whoever abandoned it hadn't bothered with care. No blanket, no food, nothing to shield from the night. Just coarse fabric against fragile skin. The cowboy shook his head, his teeth gritting as he realized the truth. This was not a mistake. This was not a lost child. This was abandonment. The horse shifted behind him, restless, as though it too sensed the wrongness of the scene. The cowboy rose, cradling the baby carefully in one arm while steadying the reins with the other. He felt the child stir, a small fist pressing weakly against his chest, not in strength but in instinct, searching for warmth, for a heart that would not vanish into the cold. He pressed the baby closer, his coat falling around the tiny body like a shield. He thought of the land around him, the stretch of desert that could swallow a man whole if he weren't careful. He thought of the creatures that roamed at night, sniffing for the faintest trace of life. Coyotes, wolves, scavenger birds that circled when the air grew still. And here, in the middle of it all, someone had chosen this spot to leave a newborn. He could almost picture the hands that had tied the sack shut, walking away without a sound, never turning back. The thought made his stomach twist. The baby whimpered again, and the cowboy looked down, meeting the watery eyes blinking up at him. His throat tightened, dry words caught at the back of his tongue. He had no answer for why life could be so cruel, why someone could abandon such innocence. All he had was the choice standing before him now. Leave the sack as he found it, ride away into the dark, or carry this fragile life against his chest and see where the trail led. The night air pressed close, heavy with silence. He shifted the baby higher in his arms, feeling the weak warmth seep into him, a reminder that this was no dream, no desert trick. The child was real, alive, and for reasons he could not explain, it had survived long enough for him to hear its cry. The cowboy set his jaw, his eyes fixed on the horizon, though there was nothing there but more shadow, more dust. He felt the baby stir again, the whisper of a voice brushing against his shirt as if clinging to him alone. And though he did not know what lay ahead, he knew one thing with unshakable certainty. He could not, and would not, leave that sack behind. The cowboy's boots pressed into the earth as he shifted the child in his arms. The horse snorted, impatient to move, but he stood there a moment longer, the weight of the newborn heavy not in pounds but in meaning. The desert was vast, cruel, and empty, but the sound he had heard, the faint word "mama," still rang in his ears like a bell that refused to die away. He felt its echo in his chest, in his bones, in a place he could not name. He looked down at the child again. Tiny eyelids fluttered, lips quivering as if searching for comfort that had been taken away before it was ever given. A fist the size of his thumb weakly clenched at his coat, gripping not out of strength but instinct, desperate for something solid to hold. The cowboy swallowed, a lump rising in his throat. He had seen men abandon cattle in droughts. He had seen horses left lame in the dust, but never had he seen a soul small enough to fit in one arm cast aside like refuse. He turned toward his horse and carefully mounted, settling into the saddle with the baby pressed against his chest. The animal shifted beneath him, uncertain, ears twitching at the strange new scent. The cowboy stroked its mane with one hand, murmuring steady words, the other hand never loosening its grip on the fragile life he carried. The night stretched out ahead, black and endless, stars scattered like sparks across a cold sky. He set his jaw and urged the horse forward. Each step of the animal's hooves struck the ground with a hollow sound, echoing faintly into the stillness. He could feel the child's shallow breaths against him, soft and quick, as though the baby's body was fighting for every second it remained in this world. The cowboy pulled his coat tighter around the bundle, creating a cocoon against the chill. His own body heat was all he could offer, yet even that felt too little. He thought of a fire, of warm milk, of shelter, things he had none of out here, alone in the desert. The silence pressed in again, broken only by the faint creak of leather and the occasional whimper from the child. Each whimper was a knife in his chest. He could not shake the question running through his mind. Who had done this? What heart had tied that sack shut and walked away? He scanned the horizon as though the answer might appear in the distance, some shadow lurking, watching him. But there was nothing, only the wind and the endless sand. He shifted in the saddle, uneasy. This was no ordinary burden. Whoever left the baby behind might not want it found. And if they saw him now carrying it, would they come back to finish what they had started? The thought gnawed at him. Still, he pressed on, holding the child close. The horse climbed a low rise, hooves scattering loose stones, and from the top the cowboy looked out over the land. The desert stretched in every direction, broken only by jagged rocks and thorny brush. Far in the distance, faint ridges of mountains caught the moonlight. The journey ahead was long, too long for a man carrying something this delicate. But he could not stop. To stop was to surrender the child to the same fate its abandoners had chosen. The baby stirred, letting out another sound, not a word this time but a frail cry. The cowboy felt it vibrate against his chest, weak yet persistent. He lowered his head, whispering softly. He had no words of comfort, no gentle lullabies. All he could offer was his voice, deep and steady, a promise in its tone if not its meaning. The child quieted, if only for a moment, as though soothed by the rhythm of a stranger's heartbeat. Time dragged. The desert was unforgiving. Cold air wrapped around him, sharp against his face. He knew that in the day it would be worse. The sun a merciless hammer, the ground a furnace. He needed to find shelter before dawn. He thought of the nearest town, miles away, farther than his horse could travel without rest. He thought of an abandoned line shack, a place he had once passed, little more than 4 walls and a roof, but it might still stand. That would have to be his goal. Somewhere, anywhere, safe enough to keep the child alive until morning. The trail dipped, the horse descending carefully. Rocks shifted under its hooves, and the cowboy tightened his grip on the reins, balancing the weight of the baby with every movement. He could feel his muscles aching, but he held on. The baby's breath fluttered against his chest, fragile as a candle flame in the wind. He prayed silently it would not go out. He could hear the faint cry in his memory again, the word "mama" echoing through the emptiness. It haunted him, not just for the sound itself, but for what it meant. Somewhere in that small body was a memory, an instinct, a longing for someone who was not there. That cry had not been meant for him, yet he had been the one to hear it. Fate, chance, divine will, he did not know what to call it. All he knew was that the burden was his now. The night wore on, stars wheeling slowly across the sky. The cowboy pressed forward, his coat wrapped tight, his arms steady around the child. With every mile, his thoughts grew heavier, questions circling like vultures overhead. How had the baby survived long enough for him to find it? What kind of life would it have if it survived the night? And was he strong enough, alone on the trail, to carry it through the dangers still ahead? Yet with each cry, each stirring breath, he found himself more determined. This was no longer just a journey through the desert. It was a fight against the cruelty of the world, a test of whether kindness could outweigh the darkness that had left a child in a sack to die. And as his horse carried them deeper into the night, the cowboy knew one thing with certainty. The sound he had heard, that fragile call for "mama," had bound his fate to this child's, whether he wanted it or not. The cowboy rode on, every jolt of the saddle reminding him of the fragile weight in his arms. The desert stretched before him, a sea of shadow and silence, broken only by the sound of the horse's hooves striking the earth. He kept one arm wrapped tightly around the baby, cradling it against his chest, while his other hand guided the reins with a steady grip. The child's breath fluttered against him, warm and weak, yet alive. That simple rhythm, inhale, exhale, became the only measure of time he trusted. The night air grew colder, seeping into his coat, gnawing at the tips of his fingers. He shifted the baby closer, letting his body shield it from the chill. The child whimpered, a thin sound that made his heart ache more than the fiercest cry could have. He hushed it softly, though his voice was rough from the trail. The sound seemed to help, if only for a moment. The little head pressed against his chest, the tiny body curling into the warmth it had been denied before he found it. He thought of firesides he had known, of women in town rocking their children, humming quiet songs as the babies drifted into sleep. That was what this child should have had: a mother's arms, a roof overhead, the safety of a home, not a coarse sack tied shut in the desert dust. The thought tightened his chest until he had to swallow hard just to breathe. He shifted his gaze forward, eyes narrowing against the moonlight, refusing to dwell on the cruelty of the choice that had led him here. The land dipped into a shallow ravine, the horse's hooves sliding against loose stone. He pulled on the reins, careful not to jolt the baby, steadying both of them as they descended. At the bottom the air was damp and cooler, the ground scattered with thorny brush. The horse snorted uneasy. The cowboy scanned the darkness, every sense sharp. Out here, danger could rise from silence in an instant: wolves, coyotes, or men with worse intentions. He pressed the baby closer and urged the horse forward, heart pounding steady in his ears. From the shadows came a rustle, faint but unmistakable. The horse froze, muscles tensing, ears flicking toward the sound. The cowboy's hand went instinctively to the revolver at his side. He sat tall in the saddle, his eyes cutting through the darkness. For a moment, nothing moved. Then a shape slipped between the brush, low and deliberate. Another followed, their eyes catching the moonlight with a hungry gleam. Coyotes. Thin, restless, drawn by the faint sound of the baby's cries. The cowboy's grip tightened. He could not fire with one hand while holding the child in the other. His mind raced. The pack lingered at the edges of the ravine, shadows flickering in and out of the rocks. They did not rush, no, coyotes were clever. They circled, waiting, testing, wearing a man down with fear before they lunged. He urged the horse forward, heels pressing firm against its sides. The animal obeyed, moving with a tense trot, eyes rolling white at the scent of predators. The coyotes followed, their paws silent on the dust, their shapes slipping like ghosts along the ravine walls. The cowboy kept his head forward, forcing his horse to climb the far side. Loose rocks scattered down the slope as the hooves struck. The horse stumbled once, the cowboy holding the child tight against him, gritting his teeth until the animal found its footing again. At the top, he risked a glance back. The pack had not given up. A dozen shadows moved below, pale teeth glinting, eyes glowing like embers. They had caught the scent of weakness. The cowboy's jaw tightened. He drew the revolver with his free hand, balancing the baby in the crook of his arm. One shot cracked through the night, the sound echoing across the desert. Sparks flew from the rocks where the bullet struck, sending the pack scattering for a heartbeat. The baby whimpered at the sharp noise, but he held it steady, murmuring low and firm, as much to soothe himself as the child. The coyotes regrouped quickly. Hunger was stronger than fear. They stalked forward again, slower now, cautious, their eyes never leaving him. He fired another round into the dust at their feet. The flash of light startled them, their howls rising high and sharp into the air, but still they lingered, unwilling to abandon the chance at easy prey. The cowboy knew he could not waste bullets. He had only a handful left and the night was long. He spurred his horse forward again, riding hard across the open land, the baby pressed close to his chest, the revolver still gripped tight in his other hand. The wind whipped against him, cold and merciless, but he leaned into it, urging the animal faster. Behind him, the coyotes gave chase, their yips and howls cutting through the silence like knives. The horse ran, muscles straining, hooves striking hard against stone. The cowboy bent low in the saddle, shielding the child with his own body, every heartbeat thunderous in his ears. The cries of the pack grew distant, their shadows falling away at last as the distance widened. Still, he did not slow. Not until the land dipped once more and the sound of their howls faded into the distance. Only then did he ease his grip, his chest heaving, the baby still safe in his arms. The child stirred, a faint whimper rising again. The cowboy looked down, meeting the small, glassy eyes that blinked up at him. "You're safe," he murmured, though the words felt fragile in his throat. The truth was, he had no promise to give. But in that moment, saying it out loud gave him the strength to believe it, even if just for another mile. The horse slowed to a steady trot, foam at its mouth, sides heaving from the run. The cowboy guided it onward, deeper into the desert, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Somewhere ahead there had to be shelter, some place where fire could burn and a child could survive the night. Until then he would ride, every muscle tense, every thought fixed on the fragile warmth in his arms. The danger was not gone, he knew. The night was only half over and more shadows lay ahead. The horse slowed as the land leveled out, its breath steaming in the cold night air. The cowboy loosened the reins just enough to let the animal recover, though he never eased his hold on the child. The baby's weight pressed against his chest, lighter than anything he'd ever carried, yet somehow heavier than all the burdens he'd borne on the trail. He could still feel the tremor of its breath, uneven but present, and every rise and fall of that tiny chest became his only measure of victory. One breath meant one more second alive. 1 second meant there was still hope. The desert around him stretched endless, a dark sea of silence broken only by the crunch of hooves on hard ground. He knew the land well enough to recognize the shape of the hills ahead, the faint line of scrub trees marking where water sometimes gathered after storms. A shack stood not far beyond that ridge, or it had once, years back when men tried to scratch out a living here. He had passed it before, half falling, its roof sagging, its door hanging loose. But even ruin could be salvation when the night was this cold. If it still stood, it would be the only chance they had until daylight. The baby stirred against him, letting out a soft cry, not strong enough to pierce the stillness but enough to quicken his pulse. He adjusted his grip, tucking the child tighter into his coat, whispering low, steady words. He had no idea what comfort a newborn understood, but his voice was all he had to give. The sound calmed the tiny body, if only for a moment. His thoughts wandered as he rode, turning over questions he could not silence. Who had left the child out here? A mother with no choice, a father with no conscience, or strangers who had never wanted it in the first place. He thought of the sack rough, tied cruelly tight, left with no blanket, no food, no water. No accident, a choice. His jaw clenched and he felt anger burn in his chest. But anger would not keep the child alive. Only action would. The horse climbed the rise, hooves scraping against loose rock, and as they crested the top he saw it, the shack. A dark outline leaning against the moonlight, barely standing but still there. Relief swept through him like a wave, though he forced his face to remain set, his focus sharp. Shelter meant safety, but only if he made it inside before anything else on this land caught their scent. He urged the horse forward, closing the distance. The shack loomed larger, its roof patchy with holes, its wooden boards warped from years of wind and rain. Still, it was 4 walls and a roof, and that was more than the child had when he found it. He slid from the saddle, boots hitting the ground with a dull thud, and quickly checked the doorway. The hinges groaned as he pushed, the smell of old wood and dust spilling out. It wasn't much, just emptiness, broken beams, and a stone hearth long unused. But it was enough. He carried the baby inside, lowering it carefully onto a fold of his coat laid out on the ground. The child whimpered, small fists curling in the cold air, but its eyes fluttered open just enough to look up at him. He struck a match with trembling hands, lit a stub of candle he kept in his saddlebag, and the weak flame threw long, flickering shadows across the walls. He set about gathering scraps of wood and brush piled in the corners, striking another match until fire sparked in the hearth. The warmth spread slowly, thin at first but growing. The baby quieted as the air grew less sharp, its cries softening into faint breaths. The cowboy knelt beside it, holding one small hand between his calloused fingers. He stared at the tiny palm, so fragile it seemed it might vanish if he pressed too hard. He thought of all the dangers still waiting outside. The cold, the hunger, the people who might come searching for what they had abandoned. He thought of how little he had to give, a lone man with nothing but a horse, a revolver, and the clothes on his back. Yet in that shack with the fire casting warmth across the floor, he felt something stir inside him that he hadn't known in years. Responsibility, duty, maybe even purpose. The night deepened, coyotes howled far off, their cries drifting over the land like warnings. The cowboy sat with his back against the wall, revolver within reach, the baby nestled in the crook of his arm again. Every time it stirred, he adjusted, whispering the same low words until it calmed. His eyes stayed on the doorway, sharp and watchful. He had seen too much in his life to believe the night would give him peace. He knew danger had a way of creeping close when a man let his guard down. His thoughts circled back to the sack. The knot had been tied so tight it was meant never to come undone. That image haunted him, made him wonder if someone out there would notice soon that their cruel task had failed. Would they follow? Would they search to finish what they had started? His grip tightened around the revolver as he considered it. He might be one man, but he was ready to fight with all he had to keep the baby safe. The fire popped, sparks jumping, light spilling across the baby's face. For a brief moment, the child smiled in its sleep, as if dreaming of something kinder than the world it had known so far. The cowboy felt his throat tighten again, and he turned his gaze back to the doorway, refusing to let the moment soften him too much. The night was not over, and his burden had only just begun. Still, as the minutes stretched and the warmth filled the small shack, he realized he could not imagine leaving the child behind, not now, not ever. Whatever road lay ahead, it was no longer his alone to travel. He would ride with this child, fight with this child, endure with this child. And if the world came to take it back, it would have to go through him first. The fire whispered in the hearth, its faint glow painting the walls in shades of orange and shadow. The cowboy sat still, one arm curled around the baby, the other resting on his revolver. The air inside the shack was warmer now, though drafts of cold still slipped through cracks in the boards. Outside, the wind prowled against the walls, carrying the far-off cries of coyotes. Each howl sent a ripple of unease through him, but he didn't move, didn't blink. His eyes stayed sharp, waiting, watching. The baby stirred, a soft sound leaving its lips, and he looked down. Tiny eyes blinked open, clouded but searching, settling on him with a trust he hadn't earned. He felt the gaze sink deep into him, heavy as stone, asking without words, "Will you leave me too?" His throat tightened. He pulled the child closer, letting its warmth press against his chest, and though he gave no answer, his arms spoke for him. Time passed slowly in the shack, measured not by minutes but by the rhythm of fire crackling and the baby's uneven breaths. Each sound mattered. Each was proof that life clung on. The cowboy shifted once, stretching his legs, though the weight in his chest never eased. He wasn't used to caring for anything this small, this fragile. Horses, cattle, men who rode beside him, he knew their strengths and their limits. But this child, it had nothing to shield itself, nothing but him. The fire began to dim, flames curling lower as the wood burned down. He rose carefully, laying the baby back on his coat, and crossed to gather more brush from the corner. The boards creaked under his boots, loud in the silence, and the baby whimpered at the sound. He paused, waiting, then whispered low until it settled again. He returned to the hearth, fed the fire, and watched the flames rise once more. When he sat back down, the child reached out with one small hand, fingers curling in the air until they brushed against his coat. The cowboy caught the movement, and without thinking, he extended his finger. The baby's grip closed around it, weak but determined. That touch was a chain, not one of steel but stronger, pulling him deeper into a bond he had never sought. His chest swelled with a strange ache, both heavy and grounding. Outside, the wind shifted. He heard something different than coyotes, sharper, closer, a crack of branches. The horse stamped nervously, tethered just outside the shack. The cowboy's hand tightened on the revolver. He lowered his gaze to the child, sleeping once more, then turned his eyes back to the door. Shadows moved across the slats as if someone lingered just beyond. He rose silently, setting the baby down on his folded coat again, and stepped to the doorway. His breath slowed, steady as he pushed the door open just enough to see. The moon lit the desert in silver, showing every rock, every bush, every broken fence post. For a long moment nothing stirred. Then in the distance a shape moved, two, maybe three, too tall for coyotes, too quiet for harmless travelers. The cowboy's jaw hardened. Whoever they were, they had no reason to be out here in the dead of night, unless they were searching for what he had found. His fingers brushed the revolver's grip, but he did not fire. Not yet. Firing meant giving away the shack, giving away the child. Instead, he stood still, blending with the shadow of the doorway, watching. The figures lingered, their heads turning as though scanning the land. One lifted an arm, pointing toward the ridge. Then slowly, they moved on, fading into the distance. He waited until the desert swallowed them whole before stepping back inside. His chest rose and fell with the weight of the close call, though his face stayed stern. He returned to the fire, sat down again, and gathered the baby into his arms. The tiny body shifted, pressing against him, as if sensing the danger that had passed. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The hours crept by, the fire keeping them company as the night thinned. Dawn began to touch the edges of the sky, faint streaks of gray chasing away the stars. The shack filled with the dim promise of morning. The baby stirred, opening its mouth in a soft cry. The cowboy adjusted his hold, rocking gently, though the motion was awkward in his rough arms. Still, the child quieted, its head resting beneath his chin. Light spilled slowly across the desert, washing the land in pale color. He could see farther now, the ridges, the dry riverbed, the line of hills beyond. The world was waking again, but he felt none of the ease that usually came with sunrise. The day would bring its own trials. Food, water, decisions that could not wait. He glanced down at the baby, its face peaceful in the new light, and knew one truth. Whatever lay ahead, he could not walk away. The shack might have given them one night, but it could not give them tomorrow. Tomorrow, he would have to ride. Ride to town or farther to find someone who could help. But even that thought tangled in his chest. Could he trust anyone else with the child? Could he lay it in another's arms after hearing that cry, "Mama," meant for someone who never came? The fire popped softly, the sound grounding him in the present. He stroked the baby's back, eyes scanning the horizon through the cracks in the boards. Somewhere out there, danger still lingered. Somewhere out there, the people who had abandoned this life might still be watching, waiting. But here, in this moment, inside this fragile shelter of wood and firelight, the cowboy held firm. The desert had asked him a question in the middle of the night, and though he hadn't spoken it out loud, his answer was carved into every choice he made from the moment he opened that sack. The baby sighed in sleep, small fingers still gripping his coat, unwilling to let go. The cowboy lowered his chin, resting it lightly against the child's head, and let the fire burn steady as the dawn crept closer. The night had not broken them. The morning was here, and with it came the weight of everything still to come.